Our next speaker is Hartmann Scholtz from the Leibniz Institute in Germany. And he'll be talking about what does international environment law have to do with the microbiome, a brief overview of the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing, and digital sequence information. And the presentation will be done through a video. So
I will start the video shortly.
Thank you, Dominic.
Good morning, everyone, or actually good afternoon for you there in Chile. Apologies, this ended up being a recorded presentation. That's my fault, completely on me and not on the conference organizers. I am delighted to be here today. My technical training, my PhD actually was in human microbiome research, so I commend you on all that you've accomplished so far, and I'm delighted to be back with this community today. However, the topic that I'm going to cover for you today is actually something to do with science policy, or actually more specifically, international environmental law. What could be the intersection with human microbiome research? And to explain that, you're going to have to recognize some buzzwords that we like to use in policy, namely the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing, otherwise known as ABS, and digital sequence information, or DSI. With that, let me give you a little bit of orientation. If you are a sort of somebody that's paying attention to politics or policy, you've probably heard about the climate change negotiations. And at a fundamental level, you're probably aware that there are international environmental agreements that make our planet better, that are run by the United Nations, and that come to long-term agreements. You might remember, if you were growing up in the 80s, the ozone layer had a big hole on it, and that was actually the Montreal Protocol. And actually that had led to a lot of success. The ozone hole closed up. But if you look down here into the 90s, you can see 3 treaties that were opened up at the 1992 Rio's Earth Summit. And many of you have probably heard of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's Kyoto, and then Paris, and then Dubai. So all of those climate change negotiations happen under the UNFCCC. The work I'll be talking to you about today happens under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is one of the maybe lesser known conventions from the Earth Summit from 1992. The Convention on Biological Diversity is really about 3 main objectives. One is probably pretty obvious, which is the conservation of biological diversity. It has to do with the 6th mass extinction that is largely human-induced. It has to do with the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity. And the third one is probably the least intuitive one, and this is where that acronym ABS comes into play, because this is the idea that there should be fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. And this concept is basically a trade-off, a political balancing act between the first 2 objectives and the third. This basically says and establishes an international law for the first time, really, that countries, nation states, have sovereign rights over their biodiversity. So just like with oil, gas, or minerals, you cannot go into a country's borders, take and use their biodiversity without asking permission. That's basically what benefit sharing means in a nutshell. And that principle, that rule, has been in place since 1992, but it has taken quite a while for this to become broadly mainstream in the research community. And I think that many would argue it is now there. And the job of this talk and others like me and people that work in this space is to continue that sort of broader uptake. So from 1992 to 2022, the UN fora that focused on access and benefit sharing, and the main one is the Convention on Biological Diversity, but there are a few others, focused on access to biodiversity samples. That is to say, physical samples done during field work, done during sample collection. And the policymakers at the time decided to use the term of art genetic resources to define those biological samples, anything containing a unit of heredity. So that includes everything from viruses all the way up to large charismatic mammals. Why am I, working at the Leibniz Institute DSMZ, involved in this? That's because we're a very large culture collection of very large biological resource centers, and we have made a commitment to fulfill international obligations on exchanges of biological material. We send material out to around 86 countries. We receive 2,000 deposits a year, and we send out 40,000 things. And because of this sort of presence, we really feel compelled to ensure that the sovereign laws of countries are respected, and we ensure that compliance when things come into our collection and when they're delivered further onwards. So I kind of explained it in the previous slides, but access and benefit sharing is simple in principle. It means asking for permission before taking and using material for R&D, and it means giving something back. That's the benefit sharing. It can involve, in the case of academia, often joint research collaborations, co-authorships, training, in-kind support, et cetera, and ideally should contribute back to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. It does apply to both commercial and non-commercial research. Many academics think it doesn't, but this is an important area of scientific cooperation and really fundamentally about good scientific practice and research ethics. Here in Europe, the Nagoya Protocol was implemented by EU Regulation 511, and it allows member states at the national level to choose whether or not they regulate the access to their biodiversity. So for example, France, Spain have decided that they regulate access. Germany has decided it does not regulate access to genetic resources, but the regulation harmonizes across the union that all member states will check their users for compliance on following the national laws of all countries in the world in terms of access and benefit sharing. As mentioned, it covers all kinds of biological organisms, including pathogens, including potentially microbiome, which is, I think, why the organizers invited me here today. And it is non-overlapping with the Nagoya Protocol in terms of national laws, meaning the EU regulation can sometimes be narrower in scope than some countries' national laws, which is why you see this concentric circles on the right, meaning that ABS can be bigger. A country can define a bigger, broader material or temporal scope than the Nagoya Protocol, and the EU regulation sometimes goes farther down into a nutshell. This is an area that I could spend literally hours talking about, and I will spare you that today, but if you have questions on this, I'm happy to take them later. The problem for many in research with the Nagoya Protocol is that the procedure to comply with these principles is very difficult. And we came up with this flow chart in a publication a number of years ago now, and sort of pointed out that this is really where the crux of the matter is. Users are responsible for identifying the national authority in charge of telling you how to comply with those laws. There is an international website called the ABS Clearinghouse. You can type it into your computer right now. And if you look there, it will say this, Brazil's legislation is this, and then here is the person's email address that you're supposed to contact to find out what the national laws are and then follow those procedures. However, if you can imagine, 100 countries in the world all do it differently. This can lead to very different response rates, very different procedures, and has led to a fair amount of frustration on the part of users of how to actually do this compliance. To that end, when we in academia about 4 or 5 years ago complained to the German government and said, this is really hard, we actually came up with project funding in response to set up something called the Nagoya Protocol Hub project, which is a help desk of sorts, a supportive community to help users comply with ABS. And I put this website up here to tell you if you have and want or need further information on this, this is a great place to start, and I'm happy to, I'm the project lead, and I can offer to do a more in-depth workshop or a webinar if there was a subset of the GloMiNe community that wanted to know more about how to do ABS compliance. It is relevant to the microbiome community because the Nagoya Protocol says that countries are allowed to regulate microbiomes if they want to. They can decide at the national level. And for other project work that we've done with pathogens, we have reached out individually to a number of countries listed here. And you can see the ones on top have said, well, for human-associated samples, they're not within the scope of our national ABS laws. But in some countries, for example, the blue box at the bottom, you do need a permit. You need to contact the authorities, and you need to procure the legal compliance documents to be able to sample and take even human microbiome samples. And that is this sort of tricky spot for ABSs to figure out how to do that. So you might be now saying to yourselves, well, what if we just source our microbiome data, what we need, from open databases and skip the hassle of the Nagoya Protocol? We don't have to do field sampling. There's a lot that's already out there. And this is not the first time that you or others have had that thought. This is fundamentally the DSI debate, which is the digital sequence information debate that I'm going to tell you a little bit about as I wrap up. I wanted to really have a plea here in my talk, which is I set up 3 years ago now something called the DSI Scientific Network, which was to give an international voice, a scientific voice, to the negotiations on digital sequence information. And I would love if there are interested members out in the audience today that are turned on by this type of policy or international UN politics to please consider joining the network and to continue to bring a broader and more diverse perspective to this type of work. Fundamentally, the DSI Scientific Network had a core message that it brought into the negotiations that happened a year ago. That was the first official decision on whether or not there should be restrictions put on open databases in order to ensure that benefit sharing could happen. And co-authors and I put together this Nature Communications paper coming up on 2 years ago now to say if you're going to do benefit sharing from open data, it has to be multilateral and not bilateral, meaning individual countries making individual rules about what benefit sharing should look like will never work in a big data open access world. Instead, we said multilateral and benefit sharing in order to support science and conservation. The principles that we outlined in this article were really quite simple, probably for this audience. I hope that they resonate. We said that benefit sharing needs to be decoupled from access, that we saw the moral and ethical compulsion for needing benefit sharing, but that it had to be compatible with open access principles, that the solution needed to be simple, that the science of big data is complicated and the legal framework couldn't be, that this needed to be harmonized with other international treaties, so the WHO, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agricultural Organization, and the UN Convention of the Law of the Seas are also making laws in this space. And we really said it would be really nice if the Convention on Biological Diversity coordinated and harmonized their work with them, and also supportive of biodiversity. Finally, that fairness and transparency would be important, and that open access databases, like GenBank, of course, could provide data to policymakers, but that fundamentally they shouldn't be involved in being the database police to enforce benefit sharing rules. We took this message and others to Montreal a year ago in December, and really conducted at that meeting and a lot during the pandemic and in meetings leading up to COP15, and said, this is our message, and really tried to make a very strong presence at those international negotiations. Ultimately, DSI was part of the global biodiversity framework. So that is the first time that the biodiversity international community has had quantitative goals and indicators to measure success or failure on meeting biodiversity and species loss targets. This will set the strategic agenda for the next 30 years under the CBD. And because DSI, the fifth item here on this list, was part of this broader political package, it creates the political, you give me this, I give you this balancing act that politicians need. So you might think, why on earth would politicians make a deal on anything to do with open access databases? And the fundamental reason is to get a large scale biodiversity agreement in place. So what is, this is like the sort of cliffhanger. These negotiations went very late into the night and ended up in the high level ministry segment of the meeting in the very last 2 days. And ultimately this was the final scene. So we did not know what was in the final text of that package deal of these texts right here until after it got pushed through in the very last minute. And what we found out afterwards, the final language really on digital sequence information says there is a list of principles that define the parameters or the criteria for how DSI benefit sharing should be. There is, luckily, and I think due to the work of myself and many others, a clear focus on open access to scientific data combined with improved data governance and equity. The parties also committed to do 3 studies. And most importantly, and this is really quite groundbreaking, they decided in a consensus-based way to establish a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for digital sequence information. The decision is ultimately everything and nothing. It decides to establish this multilateral mechanism, and it says we're going to take the next 2 years to figure this out. So a time-bound process up until COP16, which will take place in Colombia in October 2024. So it said we're going to do this and then we're going to figure it out in the next 2 years. And I'm very actively involved in that process, trying to figure out how this new mechanism will look like and how the new implementation rules will be. The take-home messages that I hope you heard today is that you must ask the country of origin or indigenous people and local communities if microbiome samples that are covered by their national laws, and you should start with the ABS Clearinghouse. If you need help, you can get it at the Nagoya Protocol Hub project. And then on the DSI topic, you should know now that there are ongoing UN negotiations under 4 different fora that will impact the governance of open access sequence databases, and that life as you know it in terms of open access to sequence data will not stay the same as it has been so far. And if you want to be part of policy outreach on this topic, please join the DSI Scientific Network at that email address. And with that, I would like to say thank you again, and look forward to any follow-up questions or emails.